like to conclude the memory lecture with just my final say about everything. In this lecture, we learned basically threes. The three, whoops, let's make this a little bit bigger for you. Okay, the memory lecture was all about the three processes of memory. So what we should have learned from the three processes of memory are that there's encoding, storage, and retrieval. So those three things right there should have taught us a lot about how to improve our memory. One way to improve the memory is to really pay attention. If you want to be better at remembering people's names, then when they say their name, you immediately really focus on the name. Don't focus on their hair, don't focus on their clothes, you focus on remembering the name. And then you would also try to think of a way to remember the name. You would focus, truly focus on it. It doesn't just come naturally. We also want to increase our storage by studying before we go to sleep and not being too stressed when we're trying to remember something. And finally, for retrieval, what that lesson taught us is that in order to retrieve something, we need to organize the memory so that we know exactly where it is in the brain. And the only way that that happens is by relating it in a way that we know. The next thing that we learned was we learned that there's three types of memory. And so we learned that there was sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. I think the strongest lesson that we should take from that is the limits of short-term memory, is we cannot learn more than 7 new things at once. So it's very important that when studying new material or trying to learn new material is we need to break it down into small, manageable pieces to work with. Okay, another thing that we learned was we learned the three parts, or the three brain parts, three main brain parts involved in memory. And what we can take away from that is that memories are stored up in our cortex. They're stored in neural networks, and these neural networks are organized by meaning. So again, it's very, very important that if you want to try to remember something, you must make it meaningful to you. Then we learned that the hippocampus, which is the part that kind of organizes all the memories that are stored up in the cortex, it's located right by the emotional center of the brain, the amygdala. And so for the amygdala, since that's the emotional center of the brain, and we know that the two work hand in hand together, it's important that when we want to really try to remember something, it would be best if we make it emotional. So relate everything that you're trying to learn to something that's kind of emotionally meaningful to you. So then we also we wanted to talk about some memory improvement strategies. So the memory improvement strategies that I'd like to remind you of from lecture is, I want you to recall the forgetting curve, is that if you're really trying to learn something, you have to know that it's going to leave you the minute that you stop looking at it. That was the forgetting curve. And that it's best that as soon as possible, as soon as learning something, it is better to study it right away rather than letting a lot of time pass, because you have more that you have to relearn or learn over again. Whereas when you start organizing it in a meaningful way right after learning it, you have less to relearn. Another thing is that you might want to practice the things that you want to remember. You might want to start saying them out loud. So if you say them out loud, then we know we activate more parts of the brain and stronger neural networks get formed. One other thing is that maybe you want to study for an essay test even if you have a multiple choice test, because if you can recall it, which is what an essay is bring it out from your brain without any cues at all, then definitely when you have the cues you should be able to pick up on them. You probably want to study before you go to sleep, because we talked about the importance of that. And you want to study in short, frequently spaced intervals rather than one big, long interval. So this has concluded my lesson on memory. I guess I want to just add one last thing, is memory and stress. I believe why some people do poorly in school is because they get so stressed. So if you can recall back to that picture of the brain that I showed you, and I said, okay, all of the memories are stored up in the cortex. And then we had the amygdala, which is the emotional center of the brain, and the hippocampus. When we get stressed, the amygdala is heavily activated, and when it's heavily activated, it kind of interferes with the hippocampus being able to organize the memories effectively or being able to access the memories effectively. So a lot of people before the test, they know the information very well, but the minute that the test is laid down on the desk, their amygdala becomes so active that now the hippocampus cannot access all the memories that are up in the frontal lobe. Also, many of us can relate to that we have done things when we are under stress that we probably never would have done before. And what happens is our frontal lobe and cortex are deactivated when we're under stress, and our amygdala kind of takes over. And our frontal lobe is what allows us to be moral, and it allows us to access our old memories and so on and so forth. And so when there's severe stress, sometimes our reasoning part of the brain just gets shut down. It's an interesting thing. But anyway, on that note, I'm going to end this lecture.